Hello and welcome to Wall Street Vision, a show that explores investment ideas from the best investors in history. I'm your host, Vlad. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for investment decisions. In this week's episode, I want to go over some lessons from Charlie Munger. If you've never heard of this guy, he's been Warren Buffett's right-hand man for many years. He's a really great investor. He's a self-made billionaire, and he's also donated tons of money to charity. A lot of people attribute Warren Buffett to being the best investor of all time. Warren's brain is laser focused on investing. I like Charlie because apart from being a great investor, he's a much more well-rounded person. I feel like Charlie's lessons can be used in investing and in life. Charlie has proven his investment skills over a long career, and in 1995, he made a speech at Harvard. In that speech, he went over 24 things that screw up people's decision making. Successful investing comes down to a lot of factors, but good decision making is one of the really important ones. At the end of the day, an investment involves collecting data and making a decision about the best possible outcome. That's hard to do because the brain has these blind spots, and the blind spots can mess up your decision making. These blind spots are also called biases or mental biases. So in order to make better decisions when it comes to investing, you have to be aware of what these biases are. Now, the speech is awesome, so I really recommend you check it out yourself. You can find it on YouTube. I think the best way to understand these biases is through stories and examples. This week, I'll cover some of the biases from Charlie's speech. I'm not going to get through all of them in this episode, but I want to mention a few that stand out to me. Bias number 1 relates to incentives. Now, Charlie starts off by saying that almost everyone thinks they understand the power of incentives. Charlie has done a ton of research on them, and despite that research, he still underestimated the power of incentives. Well, if Charlie underestimated the power of incentives, I'm sure I have as well. The example Charlie gives is from FedEx. So FedEx wanted to offer overnight package delivery, but they had a lot of difficulty getting it to work. To get overnight delivery to work, you need a big team of FedEx employees at the airport working together to move the packages from a warehouse into airplanes. That's a lot of coordination on a tight timeline. FedEx tried everything to get this done and nothing was working. Up to this point, FedEx was paying all the workers by the hour. So the employees would take their time because they're getting paid more the longer they take to complete the work. It makes sense, right? If my job is to distribute 50 boxes into an airplane and I'm getting paid $15 an hour, why would I rush and get it done faster? I'm getting paid by the hour, so I'll just take my time. So someone had the idea of paying them by the shift instead of paying them by the hour. This meant that if they finished early, they could go home and still get paid for the whole shift. Well, after changing the pay structure, the employees had an incentive to finish everything quickly. Because if they work really hard and finish their work early, they get to go home early and still get paid for the full shift. Essentially, they would be increasing the amount of money that they would get paid per hour. This worked really well. The incentive for the employees was there, and that made all the difference and allowed FedEx to become the huge company it is today. So incentives need to be lined up with the goals that the company is trying to achieve. If you're investing in a company, it's good to know how the incentives inside of that company work. What metrics matter to management, and do they get compensated more for short-term performance or long-term performance? I'll give you a really simple example. Let's say a company's management has the goal of increasing sales. And if they increase sales, their bonus is going to go up. Well, it's really easy to increase sales if they let their customer acquisition costs to get totally out of hand. They can just spend a ton of money on poorly targeted marketing campaigns, and that will increase sales. The company is going to end up with lots of sales, but no profits. So in this case, it would be way better to have the metric that the management is judged on be something like increasing sales while maintaining or increasing profit margins. As you can imagine, incentives cause biases. It's kind of like asking a barber if you need a haircut. I doubt that the barber would ever say no. So be aware of the incentives people have, because incentives will drive a lot of behavior. Someone can say they want to do one thing, but if their incentives are not aligned with what they say, they will subconsciously avoid doing it. This can apply to anything. Incentives are super powerful, and when you take a moment to think about them, you can really understand a situation a lot better. This can help you if you're trying to predict what might happen in the future. Incentives are so powerful that they're likely to affect people's behaviors and actions. The second bias is psychological denial. Charlie talks about this family friend who had an amazing son. The son was a super athlete and a super student. He went to fight in the war and never came back. Well, his mom never believed that he died, and she was a very sane person. Sometimes, if the reality is too hard to deal with, your brain can just distort reality so that it's bearable. Now, it doesn't have to be that extreme. It can be a more subtle thing. Let's say you have an emotional attachment to an investment. Maybe you buy an amusement park stock because you loved going on amusement rides as a kid. If the financials of the stock don't look good, your brain might be in denial about it and cloud your judgment. The thing about this bias is that it's not black and white. You can have different degrees of denial in between. So maybe you're listening to management talk about the prospects of their company, but they're in a declining industry and are in denial about the future prospect of the company. Denial is a super powerful force, and it affects us all. To avoid this trap, Charlie recommends exploring the opposing way of thinking. Let's say you're thinking about buying a stock because you think it's undervalued. Well, you'd be buying the stock from someone who's selling it, so try to understand why they would be selling the stock and state their arguments for selling. Charlie says he's constantly learning, modifying, or destroying ideas. He says that rapid destruction of your ideas, when the time is right, is one of the most valuable qualities you can have. You must force yourself to consider arguments on the other side, because that can help you avoid huge mistakes. In the past, Charlie said that this ability to change views and perspectives is one of the reasons why he and Warren Buffett have been so successful over the years. This is actually a skill that Charlie has worked on developing, and he's constantly practicing it. Now, this requires a ton of mental energy to do. It's really hard to do all the research for why you should make an investment, and then do a ton of research and work on why you shouldn't make the investment. So I think it's important to be selective when you go this in depth. It's probably better to save it for the really important decisions and investments in life. The last bias relates to consistency and commitment. Charlie says that the human mind is like the human egg. When a sperm gets into the egg, it shuts down, so the next one can't get in. The human mind is like that as well. If you get an idea entrenched in your mind, it's going to be hard for another idea to get in there. Now, what's interesting is that according to Charlie, when you make your ideas public, you're just pounding your idea into your own head. This is something that Mike Berry takes very seriously. By the way, if you're not familiar with Mike Berry, he's the real-life investor from the movie The Big Short. Check out episode 2 of this podcast for the story on his amazing investment success. So when Mike Berry had his big bet against the subprime mortgages, he didn't want to start arguing with clients to defend his position for this reason. He didn't want to become the defender of the idea because it would cause him to irrationally stick to that way of thinking. Consistency bias essentially means that once you start believing a certain something, it's going to be really hard to change your way of thinking about it. So you want to be cautious about how much you ingrain your idea into your own head. As an example, let's say you believe that investing in a certain company is a bad investment. The more you talk about it to others, the more you convince yourself that you're right. At some point, you get entrenched in your idea. Well, what if things at the company change? Maybe there's new management or they launch a series of products that do really well. Consistency bias says that the more time you've spent convincing others that it's a bad investment, the harder it's going to be for you to change your mind about it. You'll want to stay consistent with your initial line of thinking. Charlie's recommendation on this is to practice arguing both sides of the argument. If you're going to say that this company is a lousy investment, that's fine, but also talk about why you might be wrong and really dig deep on this point. If time goes on and you start seeing more evidence of why your initial way of thinking was off, then be okay with changing your mind about it. Consistency bias is there because from an evolutionary standpoint, consistency actually is a really good trait. People with a high degree of consistency are associated with personal and intellectual strength, and that makes sense. Where investors get hurt is when they stay consistent with poor investment decisions. You've got to be able to recognize when you've made one and change course. So just as a quick recap of the episode, each person's brain has these blind spots that are called biases. These biases are always there, and they affect you when you're grocery shopping or when you're making investments. You want to think about incentives because they really drive a lot of human behavior. Remember that incentives cause biases. Be careful about shouting out loud about an idea that you may have, because that's just going to pound it further and further into your own head, making it harder to change your way of thinking. And also remember to think of the counter arguments to whatever you're doing. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.